Alrighty, welcome to the Plug-in Hybrid and Electric Vehicle Research Center's infrastructure webinar. Hopefully you have your cup of coffee, or if you're on the East Coast, you've got your post-lunch pick-me-up of water or iced tea, or maybe another cup of coffee. So today we're going to be talking about infrastructure. We're going to start with Priya, who will be talking about charging utilization and impacts of pricing on charger use for private users, for general public consumers. And then Alan will be talking about TNC users, and specifically the infrastructure and behavior use of the TNCs, such as Uber or Lyft drivers. And then the second portion of his presentation will be focused on the emissions related to electrified TNCs. So we will go ahead and get started. Once again, thank you for joining us.
Hi, I'm Priya. So I'll be talking about infrastructure used by plug-in electric vehicle owners who are mainly using the vehicle only for private use. So multiple studies and reports have said that home is the most important and popular charging location for this group of PEV owners. But there is also consensus that public charging infrastructure, by which I mean both workplace as well as the chargers that we see in shopping complexes as well as other locations, are important to support this market. But we have to keep in mind that it is very expensive to build the public infrastructure. Like a level 2 charger at home, the installation cost can be like a couple of thousand max, while when you start building it out at public locations, it can be tens and 20,000. If you're especially talking about DC fast chargers, it can be even more expensive. So when we plan our investment, we have to be careful about how to optimize that, and we need to determine the factors that drive the demand, not just now, but how it might look in the future, and target our policies accordingly. So in our, we did a study where we looked at the charging behavior of both battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric vehicle owners, and basically tracked their choice of charging location over the period of 5 days, the weekdays, and we mainly focused on commuters because with access to all these possible locations like home, workplace, as well as public locations. So the separate models were analyzed for battery electric and plug-in hybrid owners because their behavior might differ as the technologies are pretty different. So in terms of method, I know this is not the most important thing here, but we had a structural choice model where the choice was where the PEV owner charged on a particular day. So they had the option to not just plug in at a single location, but one of the options was if they plugged in at multiple locations, as well as they could have chose not to charge on that particular day. So we looked at multiple factors, and it was mainly like those that are considered very important in driving this demand for charging or choice of charging location. So one of the important things that we see, not just in our sample of PEV owners, but has been reported by other studies as well, like cost of charging can be a very important aspect of it. So we look at charging at home, cost of charging at work, and factors that might affect it. We also look at the driver characteristics as well as like your commute pattern, how that might affect the choice of location. We consider the effect of technology, mainly electric range of the vehicle, as well as characteristics of the charging location itself, like especially at workplace, if you have issues of congestion, if you have a time limit, what kind of chargers you have, and how many chargers, etc. The model, as it's a structural choice model, we had to we know that it's not just these characteristics or these factors, but there can be some individual level characteristics that can drive this kind of demand or choice of charging infrastructure. So we did take into account some of these individual level heterogeneity that might impact whether you charge or not, whether you are someone who just prefer to charge at a single location or you plug in whenever you get an opportunity, and where you might have a preference itself in terms of charging location. So taking into account all these factors, we estimated the model, and some of the important things that came out is that, as expected, cost of charging is definitely an important driving force, and like residential electricity rate plays a big role. So if you pay a high electricity rate, which is very possible in California with one of the highest electricity rates, then you tend to shift your charging behavior more like towards non-home locations, particularly the workplace, if it's free. So, and this kind of behavior we see both for BEV and PHEV owners, with BEV owners being more cost sensitive because they're kind of relying only on the, that's their only way of completing their commute is by charging and having their electric battery fully charged. So, and talking about this workplace, the substitution between home and workplace, we see that even in the sample, as I mentioned, if it is free, we tend to see this huge substitution towards workplace. And compared to like the ones who pay for their workplace charging, we see that 48% of their charging events are at home and only 15% is at workplace. But if it is free, in the sample of BEV owners who have free workplace charging, we see that only 20% is at home, while 44% of their charging events are at workplace. So there's this huge substitution, and it's even higher if like you are paying already a very high electricity rate at home. So part of this is like that we see people plugging in all the time at work if it is free. There's a zero price effect. Like even if they don't need to charge, they might just plug in. And we have seen it in prior studies done by the center where there's a lot of plugging in by people who may not need, causing other externalities like congestion at these chargers. So even in our model, we see this huge marginal effect of free workplace charging, whereby if compared to all else constant, if people have free workplace charging, we see that the probability of choice goes up by almost 10% for BEV owners and 6% for PHEV drivers. So that's about with cost. Now, we also explored like how vehicle technology might impact the charging behavior of BEV and PHEV commuters. Now, for BEV commuters, it's not just the range, but it's the interaction between range and commute that will drive like their need to charge and their charging behavior in general. So what we looked at for BEV owners is a ratio of commute distance to range. So what is the share of range that's being utilized? And we see that, of course, as the range goes up, people might take might take their vehicles for longer commutes. But overall, as this ratio goes up, the need for charging increases as expected. And the non-charging days reduce for BEV commuters. For PHEV, commute distance, it's not so much of this interaction, so we kind of look at the electric range separately and its impact on their charging behavior. So the biggest thing that comes out is this behavior that we right now see, that they plug in wherever they can to maximize the electric miles. This choice of multiple charging events goes down as the range of the PHEVs increase. So if that's the case, in future when we look at how it might impact the net number of charging events at these locations like home, work, and other, though the share will increase, the net number of events may reduce, primarily driven by this drop in multiple charging events on a particular day. So that was like the two big things from the study, this cost of charging and how vehicle technology impacts. But there were these other factors that we also noticed driving demand or choice of location. And we saw that there is this gender differences in charging behavior. And for both BEV and PHEV drivers, we saw that female, if the primary driver of the vehicle is female, then they have a higher likelihood of charging at home compared to any other location. Also, in terms of like demographic characteristics and especially the kind of residence that a person has, apartment dwellers and condominium, wherever there's a shared charging scenario, they are more dependent on these non-home locations than residents of detached home, who mostly have access to chargers at their residential location. And in terms of like characteristics of the charging location and how we see that if you have a level 2 charger at home, it raises your probability of home charging by a very high percentage. And at workplace, it's not just the number of chargers, but if you have a good parking etiquette or charging etiquette, it definitely has a strong positive effect on demand for workplace charging. So those are the main factors that we saw affecting the demand or choice of charging infrastructure for these PEV owners. And some of the policy implications that we can draw from these findings are definitely we have to take care of this residential electricity rate because we see in our samples as well as the study showed that people who have signed up for these EV rates tend to pay a lower electricity rate and charge more at home. So if we can promote the adoption of these special EV rates that utilities offer, then we can reduce the substitution towards non-home locations and encourage more home charging. That will also kind of reduce our investment, or we may be able to optimize our use of public infrastructure more so. Also, in case of workplace charging, free cannot be a long-term plan. Of course, it has its advantages now. It encourages PEV use as well as adoption, but for the long term, to avoid situations like congestion at charge points, we need to start developing more different kinds of pricing models where PEV owners may pay price depending on like the location of the charger. If it is in a preferred parking spot, may pay a higher price compared to if it is in like back of the parking lot, or what kind of level of charging they are using. So we need to develop more different pricing models. And related to that, like we see, as we see like this people in multi-unit dwelling are dependent on non-home locations. So one thing to do is to increase their access to chargers near residents. That will definitely reduce their dependence on non-home locations, but also related to this cost of charging at workplace. If we have people unnecessarily plugging in, that reduces the reliability or to find a charging location. So if we can price and prevent such behavior, it will also, it might encourage the PV owners from apartments to use their their vehicles for commute. And in the long run, as we see more long-range plug-in electric vehicles coming into the market, we have to adjust our infrastructure plans as well. As we saw in the study, there might be a lower need of multiple plug-in events that will reduce this dependence on public infrastructure. So we need to keep these changes in mind. Now, of course, the study is about private PV owners, and the change in charging behavior that we see is with respect to this group. Now, as Alan would talk about, that there are now other users that are coming into the market with TNC drivers driving for Uber and Lyft, also using this public infrastructure. So in the long run, we have to take into account of all these components when we are planning for our infrastructure. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Priya. We will be taking any clarifying questions right now through the question and answer or the webinar chat. And if not, we'll come back and do more questions at the end of both of those sessions and have a good discussion. So go ahead and start submitting questions through the chat. All right, Alan.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Alan Jen, and I'll be talking about infrastructure and emissions benefits of electric vehicles being used in Uber and Lyft. So you may have heard the acronym TNCs mentioned a couple times. So that just stands for Transportation Network Companies. And in this context, we're just going to be talking about Uber and Lyft, so you can use those interchangeably, although there are other TNC companies out there. Okay, so electric vehicles in Uber and Lyft. I think this is a pretty new and upcoming technology being sort of paired with this new and, well, somewhat new mobility mode, and I think that there are a lot of interesting synergies that we can talk about here. So there's been a pretty rapid growth of EVs in ride-hailing services, and it's leading to a lot of particularly interesting questions in our field, thinking about what the benefits of this technology is in ride-hailing services, whether or not they can provide the same level of service as a conventional gas vehicle. So one of the big concerns is that with a gas car, right, you have the ability to really quickly fill up your gas tank. And with these services, a lot of drivers are driving many times the average in terms of miles per day. And so there's a question of whether or not electric vehicles can sort of compete with that. We have to think about the financial barriers for drivers to adopt this technology, right? And so Uber and Lyft, importantly, don't own the vehicles that are performing on their services. And so if you think about the types of people who provide services and act as drivers for these services, there's a question of whether or not the current financial structure of owning of an electric vehicle makes sense for these folks. And then thinking about all the implications about charging infrastructure and sort of how different that is for electric vehicles being driven on Uber and Lyft platforms. Okay, and we're actually going to start with that last question today, and showing one of my favorite sort of statistics here. So this isn't like a model or anything simulated. This is from real data from a variety of charging infrastructure companies. And so we actually are able to capture the majority of DC fast charging, non-Tesla DC fast public chargers in California. So we have about 1,400 out of 1,600 chargers. And what we can see is that there's very rapid growth of electric vehicles being driven for Uber and Lyft starting in about 2017. And by the mid-2018, TNCs were using about 1/3, a little more than 1/3 of non-Tesla public DC fast charging. And that has pretty profound implications, I think, for how we think about managing charging infrastructure in the future. So one of the important things to note here is that you know, a lot of folks think about the impacts of TNCs relative to, you know, other transportation modes, and in the context of something like VMT, it's still a very sort of small issue, right? So you're thinking about on the order of a couple percent, 1 to 2%. And electric vehicles being used in TNCs is actually even smaller. So the sample here that we're observing is actually only less than about 1,500 vehicles. And so that's 1,500 out of more than 500,000 in California. And yet that small percentage of vehicles is using 1/3 of public fast charging. And so I think this has a lot of important implications about planning for infrastructure, about thinking also, you know, gaps in the research where folks are making these, you know, big complicated models about how to deploy infrastructure, and you realize if you miss something like Uber and Lyft electric vehicles, that's a huge portion of the demand that's going to be missing.
Before you move on, can you clarify, this graph is
Yes.
just California, or?
Yeah, so sorry, this graph is just California.
Thank you.
Yeah, so again, this represents by the end of 2018, about 1,400 out of the 1,600 non-Tesla DC fast chargers. Another sort of interesting thing to note is that the charging behavior is quite different for TNCs. And so when we think about how you may sort of traditionally model or get data about the use of public infrastructure, so here I've shown 3 cities in California, and these represent you know, several million charging events over the course of from, I believe, 2016 through the end of 2018. And you can see in the right column labeled other, in the 3 cities, the charging profiles are relatively similar. And again, note this isn't all charging, this is just DC fast charging in public. You get this sort of increase at the beginning of the day and sort of falling off at night. And the big peaks are sort of happening right in the morning, around lunchtime, and then the largest one is the sort of post-work commute time. You'll see lots of charging events. When we look at the Uber and Lyft, you'll notice that that valley that's happening in the early morning is actually somewhat proportionally higher, right? And so we actually see a fair number of events happening there. And then probably the other large difference is that post-work commute, which is the big peak for our regular private users, is actually a little bit of a trough for the TNC users, and that's because they are providing services at that time, right? So the commute hours are when these electric vehicles come into direct conflict with the services compared to where normally you see a lot of people charging at that time. And so we see some of these fairly distinct differences between TNC charging behavior and private charging behavior. Okay, thinking about the driving behavior. So on the left side, there is a plot that is comparing the probability densities that were derived from a variety of data sources for privately owned internal combustion engine vehicles, plug-in hybrids, short-range and long-range battery electric vehicles. So the point here is essentially when you look at how much people drive in any given day for a privately owned vehicle, they look very, very different from those using TNCs. And so there are two densities for TNCs being shown here. So one is a single service, right? And so we have actually fairly comprehensive data from Lyft and Uber about how much an individual vehicle is driving a day over the population of electric vehicles and their services. But unfortunately, we're not able to necessarily couple those vehicles together. We know that a lot of owners or drivers will drive for both services. And so here we're sort of displaying the total daily driving distribution of these vehicles across a single service, and not because we don't have the ability to combine them. We do, however, have a subset of vehicles, about 20% of the vehicles that we know are participating sort of full time, and that one, we can see that these vehicles are driving actually on average 187, about 190 miles per day. And that has actually a fairly long tail distribution. And so what that means is that when we think about these vehicles participating and driving such long distances every day, about a third of those are exceeding even the full battery range of, say, a Chevy Bolt. And that means you have to charge every day. And in fact, we're finding that where on average a private user uses public DC fast charging about once every 2 to 3 weeks, these TNC drivers are using the public DC fast charging about 3 times a day. So a pretty stark contrast between these two populations. I should caveat by saying that the full-time driving distribution is not necessarily a representation of all full-time drivers. It is a subsample of drivers that we know to be full-time, but may not represent the sort of full population of full-time EV drivers in the TNC service. On the right-hand side, we can see the types of vehicle breakdown for full battery electric vehicles being driven in Lyft services. And what you'll note is that the Bolt EV sort of really took off quickly starting in 2017 and has grown exponentially, whereas most of the other guys have been relatively flat. And that is partially due to the fact that drivers were able to take advantage of rental services that were providing Chevy Bolts. And that service is called Maven for those who are curious. Okay, so going back to this thought about how much of the range that folks are using in a given day. And so about 85% of the vehicles use less than the full range of the battery, but 15% are exceeding the range of the battery. And that means that those guys must fulfill the charging during the day in order to fulfill the trip demand and service that they're providing. However, you may have recalled that I said that these guys are actually charging 3 times a day. And so what's important to note is that as a driver for a TNC service, you're not actually able to decide, right, what trips you are taking and what trips or what types of trips that you're taking, right? So if someone gets into the app and summons you, you don't get to see your destination until you pick them up. And so because of that uncertainty, what we're finding is that a lot of these drivers are sort of trying to top off all the time and make sure that their state of charge is enough to fulfill a variety of services, and so that they can sort of have prolonged times in which they are able to provide their services. And so despite the fact that, right, 85% of these vehicles are using less than the full state of charge, we're still seeing that basically they're all charging all the time. And so how able are these drivers able to charge between rides? So in this figure, we're showing the amount of time between the start of one pickup to another pickup. And so that includes, right, the actual trip that they're making, the wait time between dropping someone off and then getting called by another rider, and the amount of time to drive to pick up the next passenger. And typically when we look at the data, we're finding that a lot of drivers have one or two sort of intense sessions or clusters during a day in which they're providing lots of service. And then in the downtime, where we'll find that these guys are going to charge. And when we think about opportunities for charging between trips, there aren't a lot of sort of large opportunities for slow charging in between trips for individual sessions, because the time between the sessions is simply too small. And I think that's partially one of the reasons why these drivers have been more reliant on DC fast charging services. Okay. So hopefully folks are able to see this animation here. So this is showing services from TNCs. So there are two things to sort of look at here. One is the green shading that's happening. So this is a quick overview in San Francisco in 2017 through about midway through 2018. So the green is telling you how many pickups or how many rides that the TNC EVs are providing, and the location of those rides. Okay, and so the darker the green, then the more rides are being provided by electric vehicles in Uber and Lyft. The second thing you'll notice is these red dots, which are the location of charging infrastructure, and the size of the dot indicates how much energy is being provided. So here, you're not, I guess, able to see the context of how much electricity is being provided to TNCs versus private vehicles. That's a more complicated figure, but suffice it to say that you can see the growth has been fairly rapid, and that actually a lot of the chargers in these regions are exceeding public use by private vehicles. Yeah, and so this provides hopefully some idea of the rapid growth of both the use of electric vehicles in TNCs and the use of charging infrastructure by these vehicles. So we're currently conducting some research on thinking about infrastructure deployment specifically for TNCs. And so what I'm going to be talking about in the next couple of slides is ongoing work. And I think one of the things that really is motivating this question is this idea of thinking about whether or not the chargers are located where they're needed specifically for TNCs. So as you can imagine, a lot of the public infrastructure isn't necessarily designed with TNCs specifically in mind. And so one of the things that we want to look at is whether or not there's a way to think about how you can deploy these chargers while keeping in mind the spatial demand and timing aspects of TNC electric vehicles. And so, you know, there are a couple reasons why you would want to do this. One, if the vehicles are located where there's high demand, where the rides are actually taking place, well, you're reducing deadheading, right, for a lot of these drivers who need to travel in between sort of high density ridership areas and where the chargers are located. And you're also cutting down on the downtime for the drivers, where they'd have to sort of travel to the chargers in between providing trips or in between those clusters of riding services that I was talking about earlier. And so being able to capture some of those benefits, I think would provide a lot more incentive for drivers to actually start thinking about using electric vehicles in these services in the future. So don't worry about the math here. Basically, we're sketching out an optimization model to think about how we can minimize downtime for TNC drivers, and populating this with real empirical data that we've been fortunate enough to use from Uber and Lyft and from charging infrastructure network providers. And so what this model essentially will be doing is that it will think about how I can install chargers in specific locations such that I'm able to minimize the downtime of drivers providing services. And it's actually going to be built to be fairly flexible so that we can adjust, right, the level of demand. We can provide sort of budget constraints to think about, you know, if I'm limited to installing only 10 chargers, or if I can install up to 100 chargers or 200 chargers, you know, what would the most strategic location be to provide those infrastructure for the electric vehicles. So that's forthcoming work. I don't actually have any results or anything to show you on that for now, but hopefully we'll be able to keep interested folks updated on the progress of that. Okay, and so one thing that I did want to point out quickly is that despite all of these factors about how different electric vehicles are on these services, this is sort of going back to that original question of whether or not gasoline vehicles and electric vehicles in TNCs are really that different. If the limitations of the new technology are actually able to provide these services. And so one of the things that we are able to look at are service provision by a representative group of gasoline vehicles compared to the population of electric vehicles in these services. And what's really interesting is that despite the fact that, you know, there are a lot of these qualitative issues, and that we've actually talked to a lot of drivers who provide us a lot of qualitative reasons about why it's a little more difficult for electric vehicles to be providing these services, we do find that there are basically no statistical difference between both the number of trips that an electric vehicle provides and the total distances driven per day that electric vehicles are providing compared to gasoline vehicles. And so, you know, this sort of contrasts with a lot of those qualitative explanations, and that we find that maybe a lot of the electric vehicles are able to perform in the same way and provide the same level of service that gas cars are able to. We don't necessarily know if this holds true for the location, so whether or not the electric vehicles are providing the services in the same areas that gas cars are. But in the context of the amount of trips and the distances, we do find no particular difference. Okay, I'm going to shift to thinking about emissions from these electric vehicles. So we're able to use a lot of this great data to think about their contribution to emissions benefits. So thinking about or employing this high resolution data on charging times, we're looking at essentially the hourly average emissions rate in California using data from the California ISO to look at the emissions per charging event. And so we're able to quantify this. You know, for every particular vehicle charging record, we can calculate the associated upstream emissions, right? So the electric vehicles themselves aren't emitting anything, but we can think about what electricity is being provided and the source of that electricity to these vehicles. And we're able to get a nice quantification of basically every charging event that we can see in our data. And so this provides us sort of the full population of observed electric vehicles and TNCs that show up in the data. Okay, and so here you can see there's sort of these two clusters of lines, and this is actually mainly due to difference in the nighttime and daytime emissions factors in California. And also, right, so you're moving sort of from left to right as you travel more, you have to charge more, and that's leading to higher emissions. Okay, and sort of straight to the punchline of this story, one of the things that we're particularly interested in thinking about is a comparison in the emission savings between TNC electric vehicles and private electric vehicles. Okay, and so what's going on here? So think about a world in which you take the average driver in California, or it doesn't necessarily have to be the average driver, right? Because the people who use electric vehicles in California might be switching from slightly cleaner vehicles. So you take a driver in California and you switch them to an electric vehicle, and then you observe the emission savings from that switch. And then we can do the same thing where we're able to compare against the fleet of gasoline TNC vehicles, and we say, let's take one of those guys and switch them into an electric vehicle and observe their emission savings. And what we're finding is that if you switched a TNC vehicle from gas to electric, you would save about 3 times as higher emissions on a daily basis compared to switching someone from an average gas car into an electric vehicle in California. And this is, you know, robust over a whole range of sensitivities, and even sort of providing the regular EV emission savings with sort of more optimistic numbers and TNC emission savings with a little bit more pessimistic numbers. You're still getting quite a bit larger emission savings. And so this is important in thinking about from a policy context. If you're sort of budget constrained and you're really thinking about how to provide emissions benefits by promoting electric vehicles, then you may think about sort of focusing incentives for TNCs because the emission savings is relatively higher. Okay, and so that's sort of wrapping up some of our findings from these emission savings, and that's actually been published in a recent report that was released in August of 2019. I've left the link here in the slides so that folks can look at that if they're interested. Yeah, and I think that's the last of my slides. Perfect. And so we'll be opening up for questions.
Okay, great. So actually, I'm going to maybe start with clarification questions first. and then transition to some of the bigger picture questions. We do have lots of questions from the audience, so thank you for submitting those, and we'll try to get through as many of them as we can. I'll first start by reassuring you all that the slides and the webinar will be posted on the ITS website and will be emailed to registered attendees. Second, and thank you for answering this already, Alan, on the last slide, if this research that you just presented has been published yet, and if not, will it be coming soon, like maybe January?
So the results that I presented has been the paper is published and it's available on Transportation Research, Part D.
Okay.
Yeah, and for mine, it's currently in peer review, but we do have like a white paper report version that's available. That's the one that I linked to at the end.
Okay, great. And that is that's the emissions report. What about the TNC charger usage? Is that another report?
Not yet. That one's ongoing work.
Still work in progress.
Yeah.
Okay. Second, okay, so Priya, we had a question. You mentioned females are more likely to charge at home. Have you done a similar analysis based on age grouping?
So we did include the age of the driver in the analysis as well, though it did not come out as significant for battery electric drivers. Among PHEV drivers, we did see that older, if the primary driver, the older he or she is, they're more likely to charge at home than at other locations. But if we just focus on the sample, we did see that in our sample statistics that older people are more likely to just charge at home than at workplace or at public locations.
That makes sense. Yeah. You may not have a workplace anymore. Okay, so Alan, a few clarifying questions on your TNCs.
Mm-hmm.
I think it included both fleet-owned vehicles like the Maven gigs and privately owned Uber Lyft vehicles.
That's right.
Okay, what percent of BEV TNCs do you think can be attributed to Mavens versus privately owned?
Yeah, so in terms of total number of just vehicles, so this isn't by miles, it's about 20%.
Okay. Let's see. There were, you said, let's see, 35% of DC fast charger use was for all of California.
Yeah.
Do you know or have you looked at what that percentage might look like in urban areas versus more rural areas?
We haven't looked at that explicitly. We would actually be able to, but I don't know whether, I don't know what the percentage breakdown of that would be. I would say, however, that the vast majority of charging is happening in urban areas.
Yeah. Okay.
Of DC fast public charging.
Okay. Let's see, a clarification on the DC fast charging data, the source of that data. Does it come from charging networks like ChargePoint and EVgo? And if so, how do those companies ID TNC drivers versus non-TNC drivers? Or is that something that we've...
Yeah, no, so no. That's, so from the network providers, the charging data does come from network providers, including EVgo, including ChargePoint, and actually a few other smaller charging companies as well. So there is a special field in which we are able to observe specific memberships. So I don't know how much I'm allowed to talk about this.
Okay, but we know it's
but so I will say, yeah, so it's real data. It's not an assumption that we're making about who is on TNCs and who is not. We do know that they are driving for TNCs.
And a similar question on the state of charge of the vehicle. That's data.
state of charge of the vehicles. So we don't observe state of charge from the network companies, but we actually do make some assumptions on state of charge based off of the travel behavior data that we're getting from the TNCs themselves. And so you can, the slide that I was showing is like amount of state of charge that that they're using in a given day. And so if I know that I have a Chevy Bolt that has 240 miles and they go, well, let's see, 180 miles in a day, then I can say, well, they've used, 75% of the state of charge. We don't know, and I don't think, hopefully I didn't show anything like this, the particular state of charge that corresponds to any particular charging event or any particular trip.
Okay. Okay. And what's the criteria you use to define a full-time TNC driver versus part-time?
Yes. And so we assume, so like I said, there's a subset within some of the charging provider data that gives us an idea of who is using, for example, like Maven services. And we presume that those guys are full-time drivers. But like I said, we're not assuming that they represent the full population of full-time drivers. When you look at the data about how much of the sort of daily travel distribution, it's actually very hard to make a cutoff for say, defining someone to be a full-time driver, because it's simply this really long gradient. And so, if my definition were to be that they're a full-time driver, if that's their primary source of income, it would be very, very difficult to discern that from the data. And so I will say that in the daily mileage distribution where we say they're full-time drivers, I think that we're making a bit of an assumption there, but I do think that given how sort of extreme the daily miles are compared to what the data we see in the single service distribution, I think it is a fair characteristic that at least they're driving a lot for these guys.
Okay. Fair enough. For both of you, I think, do we have data on public recharging costs? And let's see, to the extent of public versus private or home charging by PHEVs, so the people who actually have a choice in whether or not to charge in public, and what does that show?
So in terms of like actual rates that they're paying, we could impute using different survey questions the rate that they pay at home. But when it comes to public, we do not know like exactly the rate they paid. What we have information at the workplace is whether they pay or it is free, but there is no, we don't have the data on like exactly what they're paying for.
Well, actually we do.
But I wasn't sure if we were.
Well, okay, yeah.
It's like kind of,
okay.
we're just collecting it right now.
Well, okay. From some of the charging network providers, we are actually able to observe, again, somewhat confidential information about pricing plans, but it varies quite a bit. There are a lot of different pricing mechanisms, and so even for someone uniform like EVgo, you have plans that span a fairly big variety, and when you talk about someone like ChargePoint, who let the vendors decide, you could have a much more large number of pricing plans. For TNCs, for a subset of these guys, we actually do know exactly how much they pay, which is $0. Because, for example, under the Maven plan, the charging price is rolled into the rental price of the vehicle. And so on a marginal basis, you know, they're not actually paying for the per kilowatt hour charge, but some of that cost is rolled into the initial rental.
So can you comment on how the cost of DC fast charging may be influencing use by TNC drivers, and specifically those people who have it wrapped it into their lease costs?
Yeah, so if it's free, you're probably a lot more motivated, or you're
more likely to use it.
You're more likely to use it. Yeah. So there is some caveat with all those results, right? Is that for a lot of the free users, they're probably going to be using it more than they need, and so you know that does speak to some differences between what I'm showing now and what you potentially could see in the future. That being said, I think it's also a large opportunity. These drivers are much more price sensitive to price signals than your average consumer. And so when we think about pricing these eventually in the future, there are, I think, creative ways in which you can leverage the flexibility of TNC charging to achieve other types of goals, right? Things like grid integration and grid constraints, I think are sort of prime candidates for this.
Great. Let's see. Clarification, I think. On slide 5, you showed 2 different TNC distributions, the single service and FullTime.
Mm-hmm.
Are some of the FullTime drivers included in the single service distribution, or are they separate?
So all of the guys in the FullTime are a subset of the vehicles in the single service.
Okay.
Yeah.
So single service is everybody, and you've pulled out
Yes.
carved out a section. Okay,
That's right.
Great. Could the infrastructure model you're working on be used for transit agencies converting to battery electric buses to best determine their charging needs?
Yes, I guess it could be.
Okay.
I haven't really thought about that, but you know, conceivably, if we have demand data, then yeah, it could be adopted, I guess, for really any sort of demand.
Excellent. Okay. One question, I'm not exactly sure which vehicles were considered for this analysis. 15% exceeding range?
Those are all vehicles, all the electric vehicles in the TNCs.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And then we just have a couple more minutes. Let's see. There was a question about PHEVs that I think I'm going to try to jump over to the chat question here. What, if any, study examines the role of plug-in hybrid vehicles in reducing GHG emissions in the transportation sector? It would seem that PHEVs can address range anxiety. Any analysis of the evolving range of PHEVs? I've seen some models with a minimum range of about 26 miles. Are automakers working to increase this range? I think we don't necessarily know what the automakers are planning,
Yeah.
but.
So what we do see in one of our other analysis that if PHEVs have a higher range or a longer range, there is more incentive for them to actually plug in and use those electric miles. So compared to like PHEVs that have like, let's say, a 20-mile range or maybe a 25-mile range. So in that respect, if you have like longer range PHEVs in the future, then we can see like more of plug-in, and that will definitely have an impact on the greenhouse gas emissions compared to what we see now with shorter range PHEVs.
In TNCs, the short answer is I don't know. You'll notice that I didn't talk about PHEVs at all, and that's because, well, we don't observe them on the public DC fast charging, because PHEVs don't do
DC
DC fast charging, and second, it's really hard to tell if they're driving on gas or electricity in the data sets that I have. So.
Okay. Okay. Do you agree that your data on TNC public charging, daily driving patterns by driver type, the previous presentation by Priya on recharging cost sensitivity and increasing BEV ranges, all combine to suggest the future market for public recharging will be quite limited or focused on selected drivers? For example, TNC drivers, those without home recharging, and those few long-distance EV drivers who might be passing through the region. I think we're seeing quite a bit of other use too.
Yeah.
Right? That's this sort of fill in the blank when you forget to charge, or there's congestion at a level 2 charger, or I don't know, the power's out at your house.
Right.
We're in California today.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I would reserve judgment on that. You know, my work is focused on a particular niche and thinking about it in the overall context. There are broad reasons for using DC fast public infrastructure, and I don't think it's necessarily limited by use cases. It's a question of balance, right? How much you want to be providing for any particular use case versus focusing specifically for something like TNCs.
Okay. I think it's a clarification question for you, Alan. How do you know that these charging events occurred on shift? If drivers enjoyed charging access through a TNC or charging company relationship, do you know if the drivers may have been using their charging for personal VMT, eVMT?
It definitely could be for a personal VMT. We'd have to go through a monumental task of coupling the charging data to the TNC driving data if we wanted to specifically identify the sort of charging demand. I would charging demand specific for ridership or providing TNC service. Yeah, and so you probably do have some of this, I guess, leakage. But I mean, thinking about those miles, I mean, it's still so high, and it correlates pretty well with the gas car daily miles, and so we're fairly confident that the majority of that charging is going to be for providing TNC services.
Okay. Do we have any insights about their access to home charging, the TNC drivers?
No, not really. I would say, I mean, there's been discussion about, oh, they should just sort of charge at home, or at least fill up overnight. It's not clear that at least a lot of the users for on rental services like Maven have the ability to do that. But I think more importantly, when you look at the sort of data on travel distributions during the day and how much of the data charge they're using and the timing of the charging, it seems that DC fast charging is a pretty critical necessity for these guys to be able to operate.
And I think we're going to do one final question. We have a ton of them, and we will keep record of them and do our best to try to answer them in future analysis, because I don't think we've done all the analysis there, as well as maybe future presentations and reports. But let's go to a question we have in the chat, which is, in terms of free versus pricing, do we have any insights into the charging time? Intuition might tell us that pricing might provide shorter charging time, kind of, I guess, parked time, but some behavioral economy studies might tell us the opposite is true. When drivers are charged to charge, they might take longer at the charging stations. So are there any insights into different tiers based on kilowatt hours, quantity, or parking time, I guess, connected time, and time of day to take into account the impact on the grid?
So the data that I'm working with right now doesn't give me this flexibility to study all these effects in terms of parking, time, and pricing. But of course, that's definitely a very interesting question, and I would be happy to look at it, is like what kind of impact like different pricing models will have on charging behavior. But if we can kind of price it right, the parking and the charging component of this entire package, then we should be able to at least encourage optimal usage of the infrastructure.
Excellent, thank you. Do you think there's, I guess, to wrap it all up, the policy takeaway around infrastructure from your current research? Okay. We have a couple of questions related to kind of the policy and whether that be charging, pricing policies.
So my takeaway would be, at least for now, what I've looked at is what we see when we talk about infrastructure. It's usually done in an isolated way. People talk about public infrastructure, what's the need of that, or workplace. But what we have to think about is of it in an integrated way, that people just don't use one location. So we have to look at policies that will, like, if possible, encourage people to charge at home and reduce the dependence on other infrastructure, while keep it free for people who actually need it. So more or less, like, think of it in an integrated way and plan accordingly. Also keeping in mind the changing technology, changing user group, and so it's like a moving target and a moving plan. So yeah, it will change, it will evolve. So
a suite of policies rather than one standard.
Yeah.
And on my end, just super quickly, there are lots of different interesting policies, I think, that are relevant to the TNCs and electric vehicles being driven on those services. I would say that it's important not to start to think about these critically and not to miss them, because they're actually providing a much larger impact than I think a lot of people were expecting. And so, yeah, we should do it right. And that means thinking about critical policies that will influence behavior and deployment, and yeah, for different user groups as well.
Right. Okay. Thank you both for joining us. Thank you to those of you out on the internet for joining us today. Sorry we couldn't get through all the questions this morning, but we will try to follow up wherever we can. Thank you so much.
Thank you.